What's up? I'm Olin, and I just recently had a song come out this past week, last week, called Faster Than Sound. And I wanted to do not only a track breakdown, but also give away the lead patch that I used in the song. I used a bunch of stock Ableton stuff on this entire album, and I figured I'd give a few of them away for free, starting with the lead on this track because I use it in a few different variations for this song, as you'll see in a bit. This is my second time recording this, so if I look like I'm in the worst mood, it's probably that. Okay, so this song is super, super short, and I'm just gonna run through each part as it goes. I think it makes the most sense to start with drums. We'll go with this sound. I'll just go in order of when it appears in the song. So first off, I have this Foley sound. I've been doing this a lot the past couple of years. Well, I'll start my track with drones and a Foley pattern so that I can sort of create an implied groove. This is what it sounds like by itself. I went ahead and took out a lot. I carved a lot with the EQ because I didn't want it to be that present in the track. So I scooped out a lot of the mids, took out a ton of highs, which helps dull it out a bit. I also used an auto filter. I do this a lot, where I use auto filters to sort of take things in and out of a track. As you can see, I drew an automation, and the whole purpose of it is to take something out. What's this for? I don't know. I guess I never used that top one, but yeah, in this case, it's just to carve out low end, and you'll see, I'll explain more of that later. But it's just a splice loop that I looped into a certain pattern. It's just a little piece of a bigger loop. And I used repitch to give it a different sort of tonality, which I do pretty often, especially with percussion sounds. And that's pretty much it. So something that I think is actually pretty valuable that I learned is when you're making your drums, or when you're using breakbeats specifically, something that I like to do is making sure I have my kick and snare pattern written first. That way I can sort of make sure everything else falls in line. It's not that you can't do it the other way around, but I've noticed that it can be harder to get a chop that feels unique or structured to the song that you're making when you start with the break first. So, like I said, I'll start with my kick and snare pattern, which I'll get into right now. I initially, because of the tempo, I was gonna do a drum and bass situation, but it didn't quite fit for me, so I ended up going with more of a house pattern. Pretty clicky kick. I usually will roll off the top end of the kick a good bit, and I didn't do it this time because I think it just didn't really need it, and I wanted it to punch through. And you'll see after that, I added something that I do on almost every track, where I add a glue compressor with these exact settings every time. And the only thing that gets changed is the threshold and makeup. And the point of that is to initially just catch peaks, like anything I don't want going above a certain volume. But it also works to tuck things back in the mix, and I'll have some better examples of that later. After that, I use the A Bit Warmer preset on, again, just about everything. I love using saturation more than, I use a lot of distortion, but I think saturation is really great for adding body to a sound, making it louder, making it more present in a way that sounds more rich than sometimes distortion. Like distortion and overdrive can sometimes ruin the signal. So saturation is usually the way to go for me. And again, I put these two on like every single track, which you'll see. Next up, I have a clap, which is just on the 2 and 4. Pretty straightforward, and I cut out some of the low end. I also scooped out, I've noticed with snares and claps, there's just something about around like 7 to 900 that just doesn't sound right to me. There's something about it. Sometimes it's even up to like 1 kilohertz, where it's just, there's something in there that just doesn't sit right. It doesn't feel good. So I'll scoop it out. -4 might be a lot, but that's just where I ended up for this. And then I have my glue compressor. I have saturation. Then I also added an ambience. Sometimes I'll do this to an entire drum kit, but I almost always do it to the snares. And it's to give it, it's to put things in a room. Um, when you hear a drum set uh, in person, it picks up like you hear the reverb of the room. And so I typically do that to at least my snares to give it some tail and some life. Um, it's not too much, but it does make a difference. After that, I have some hats that are really tight. It's like a UK garage hat that I found on the Upbeat. You'll notice that I rolled off some high end because on this track I have so much going on in the tops. It's an old habit of mine to overlayer my percussion and hi-hats because I'm trying to make something really complex. And so I find myself having to roll off the high end on some of it so it doesn't make everyone's ears bleed. And then, yeah, I have my glue compressor to catch peaks and saturator. I have another hat hitting the same pattern, but there's a couple unique things going on here. First of all, it's not the same kind of sound. This one is open, which is really important. If you're going to layer sounds, you want to make sure that they have different timbres or character to them, because it saves you a lot of trouble with mixing. And also, like, it's like, why would you layer sounds if they're going to be the exact same thing? And something else I did, which there's quite a few ways to do this, but I just drew it in by hand, where you draw in the fades. So each one of these tracks or each one of these clips is fading in at a different time. So it gives the effect of closing the hi-hat at different points, so it doesn't feel so static because everything is really locked into the grid. And that's all it's doing. Cut off a bunch of lows because I don't need them. Glue compressor, I did push down the threshold again because it's to push something further back in the mix or to give the illusion of that. And then some saturation. Next up, I have this percussion sound that's more of it's like a clunky. I just loved the timbre of it. It does something cool to the rest of the, it just helps with the groove, I think. Oop. I think it just helps the groove. Without it, it's just like, I mean, it's cool, but I think having a little perk there just adds something special. It's really not doing much. I hardly did anything to it, but as you can see, I'm always, even if I don't end up using it, I will probably throw on an EQ, a compressor, and a saturation on just about every track, because usually those things, besides volume and panning, solve the problem I have with the mix. Next up, I have a shaker, which I have panned pretty wide. I have two of them. I almost always have two shakers panned pretty wide. I don't always do this, but I've noticed that when something is higher up in the mix, I'll tend to pan it wider than I do everything else, where like my kick drum is always going to be in the middle. My bass is always going to be in the middle. My vocals, unless they're backing, are going to be in the middle. And you'll notice this is going on every beat to help with the groove. And you'll notice that it has a different sort of flavor than my hats. It's a lot softer, it's less abrasive, and that's something I try to make sure of. I even have it hitting a little, it's like not exactly on the kick. I drew fades in and then consolidated it, so it's not fighting with the kick. And I think that's one of the best lessons I learned, is trying to make sure things aren't hitting at the same time, because it saves you so much trouble with the mix later. You'll notice all of these are like, they might be on the grid in the same way, but they're either at a different frequency, they have a different timbre, or they're like pushed by the millisecond over here. I'm just always finding ways to give all my instruments space. And I have so many examples of that in this song, so I'll give more examples in a bit. Next up, we have the break, which I think is probably the most interesting part of the drums. I have two different breaks going on. So the first thing you'll notice is I don't have a kick drum hitting unless I really want to accentuate that. And the snare, I have it layered so that it's giving more body to the clap that I have because the clap on its own is really fucking boring. Um, but the way I chop my breaks is I'll do something like this where like let's say I deactivate this clip so that it's not going anywhere. Um, it sort of serves as a placeholder. So then I can go here onto this clip before it. And just for the sake of example, I'll hit loop on this. Now I can play it along with my. So now I can play it along with my kick and snare and move it around. And I'll chop my break that way, which is why it's important to have your kick and snare written first. And that way, when you're chopping your break, you can make sure it actually accentuates the groove, and you come up with really cool, surprising things this way. And I go like piece by piece, so you'll notice like it doesn't really repeat itself all that much. I'll try to get like 8 to 16 bars of something different, and then I'll start repeating. But yeah, that's pretty much how I go about it. And you'll also notice I create silence. There's huge gaps in things. If I don't need it, I take it out. You want to create as much room as possible for other things to have their shine. So yeah, that's pretty much all that's going on. And the way I do that is actually through this. I hit the warp mode and set it to beats. I set this arrow so that it's just the one by itself, and then I'll drag this guy. And it sort of works like a gate. It's also a really cool way. You can change this preserve to a beat mode. And that's a cool way to do that like stutter effect as well. So yeah, that's pretty much all there is to it. For the mixing, ignore this. I don't know why I used a phaser guitar on this, but other than that, it's pretty much standard. I have my side chain to the kick so it doesn't get in the way. I've got EQ because I don't need a ton of low end and saturation. It's like that for pretty much both. I did use a little more low end on this other think break, but I even used the same snare preset to give it some space. That's pretty much all there is to it. I cut out some of the highs because, again, I have so much going on at the high end, so you have to prioritize what's going to take the lead on it. Next up, I have a ride. And this guy, I feel like this is it's a Spinnin' Records sample. It's such a classic EDM thing to do, to just add ride, because it's such a simple way to help with a groove. It's really not doing much else. I took a lot of the low end out, so that's all it's doing. It's very, very simple. And then I also have another ride that is reversed, and then I add a delay so that it does a cool, like, it adds to the groove. And there's like a ping pong delay that you can hear. And it's just to serve as like a transition effect. And that's all that is. There's no other processing to it. And then, yeah, the Foley sound I mentioned earlier. And then after that, I have another shaker that's panned wide. And you'll notice it has a different texture than the other one. Normally, I set the warp mode to repitch when I'm using shakers and stuff, but for some reason, I used Pro on this. I don't know. Things just happen the way they do. And that's pretty much it. On the group, I have a little bit of the high end cut off, and then I'm using that glue compressor to sort of catch peaks again. And I never, like, there's no set in stone way that I control this. It's really, that's where the ears come in, and I just like, it's based on more of a feeling, but nothing too difficult, which I think is important. So next up, I have the bass. We can start with what I use in the breakdown. It's a Reese sound. And unfortunately, because of how I have OBS, I don't know if I'll be able to share my plugins exactly. Um, but I used Serum for this, and I used the PWM Juno patch for this. But the real key here, because I'm pretty sure you can use sine waves for this too. The key is actually in unison and controlling the tuning of the unison on whatever synth you're using, and then just putting it through a low pass filter, and that's like all a Reese can be. To give it that sort of movement. You can also use filters. You can get really creative with resonance and filters to give things movement as well. What's giving it that extra little like thippy sound is actually this guy, this erosion, which I think if there's any tip that any of my friends take from me at all, it's this. I use erosion to make things punch out in the mix more all the time. I use it on my subs especially, but it just helps things poke out in speakers in a way that distortion I just don't think can do in the same way. I'll push it just so you can really hear what it's doing. It just adds this like white noise, and it has other features, but I always use the wide noise, and you can control how much of the frequency it is affecting, which is really really helpful. You can like push the width here, but I could have gotten away with more, but you do what you do. After that, I have an EQ that's scooping out some of the mids to make room for other stuff, but also to pull the bass out of this Reese towards the end of that breakdown, which is something I like to do a lot. I feel like if you can take out a bunch of the low end during your buildup, when the drop hits, it hits so much harder. And some people do like volume dips, like volume automation, but I get kind of scared of doing that, so I just stick with like taking out low end. After that, I have another Serum patch. This one I want to say is just a saw wave. Yeah, it's just two saw waves that I have a filter, like an envelope filter, shaping how the synth is sort of behaving. So the filter is like drawn in the way that I want the synth to sort of perform. After that, I have Rift, which is a plugin I've used in just about everything on this album, and I'll flip through presets until I find something I really like. I have a sketch cassette after that, which I don't know if it was necessary, but it's there. Especially considering the OTT right after. I think I was just trying to get a lot of bite out of this bass patch. After that, I have an EQ, which has a high shelf. I was clearly trying to make this bass stand out. Some saturation, and then a glue compressor, which again is, oh no, this is a sidechain. It's working as a sidechain compressor, which I normally don't do with the glue. I normally use the other stock compressor. Next up, I have my favorite part of this bass. This bass was actually inspired by Julesy. She's a Philly native, and I saw her play, and I remember writing this riff the next day. She's more of a Jersey club artist. If I were to like specify what she makes, but I just wanted to make something that was going to be more like a riff and would be responding to the other basses that I have. So I'll just play it for you really quick. And the only trick here, I use the same sample, but I tuned it a bunch. And the real trick here is coming from the clip itself, where I transpose it. Oh my god. As you can see, there's a transposition situation going on here. And I'm pitching that sample so that it feels more like a bend, because without it, it would just be pretty stagnant. And I added Rift for the same reason that I've used Erosion. I feel like Rift is a much more intricate way to do something that I would typically do with Erosion, and then I have it sidechained to the kick. But again, the big point here is to try not to have things playing at the same time. Let's go faster. So the vocals are pretty interesting. I did post a reel on my Instagram a while back talking about how this track, when I started it, was initially inspired by this Charlie XCX sample of her song Lightning. And I didn't have the money to clear it. So I decided to sing my own part instead. And that's something that I do all the time. I'd recommend it if you're not, if you want to get into writing your own lyrics. This is a method that I would highly suggest. You start singing gibberish, just singing and recording yourself until you feel like you've locked into a groove. It'll feel very meditative at times, but you're just trying to lock in a melody that really sticks out to you. And once you feel like you have that, you can listen back to it. And it's kind of like looking at clouds where your brain will sort of just make up shapes that aren't there. Your brain wants to fill in that gap. And so you'll naturally start to pick apart words from this gibberish where it's like, oh, it kind of sounds like it's saying this. I can probably build off of that and find rhymes that work with it. Or with dance music, sometimes you don't even have to rhyme. You could just be one phrase. But that's kind of how I approached this song. I took what the lyrics sounded like they were, because it was a lot of chopping going on, and just navigated it from there and wrote the rest from there, and I think filled it in with splice samples after that. The final recording that I have sounds like this. And yeah, so it's nothing groundbreaking, but I just like sang what it sounded like it was saying when I was doing all these chops. I have this M auto pitch that I used a ton on my vocals for this album, because it has this thing called format shifting, which you can do in Ableton's Warp Mode, but it's a free plugin, a free auto tune. It doesn't take up a ton of CPU, and the format shifter is great because it not only shapes the characteristic and tone of the audio, it also kind of pitches it in a really interesting way. And sometimes I'll just throw an LFO on that, so it's like moving randomly, but so I did that a little bit. I EQ'd it to hell. I have a really bad habit of tucking my vocals in more than they should, so that I wouldn't recommend following this EQ situation. Sidechain to the kick, and then some saturation. A lot of this is mainly saturation. There's a delay, a ping pong delay happening for more of an ethereal effect. I'm using glue compressor to push things back in the mix, but I think if there's anything you completely ignore from this entire video, it's how I process my vocals, because I have a bad habit of suppressing my voice. Anyways, so next up, I have this vocal chop that I stole from Splice. I didn't steal it. I bought it with credits. It's just hitting on every beat, and I use an auto filter to bring it in and out of the song, so it's like a cool build effect. And I do that all the time. So instead of just like snatching things out, I sort of bring them gradually in and out. I've got an EQ to tuck it away a bit, sidechain to tuck it away a bit, and then some saturation to bring it back out. Next, I have the same splice sample, but extended a bit more. I'm pretty sure I made this first and then added the rest later. But this is meant to be a response to not just my lead vocal, but to the bass riff that I created. It sounds like this. It's just pitched up like 4 semitones. And when I do my vocal chops, I treat it the same way I do my break, where I have a deactivated clip, and then I'll put something in front of it so that it doesn't move anywhere, and I can drag my loop anywhere I want. And that's pretty much it. It takes a little bit of time, but it's not It's not the worst. I know you can play things in, but I just like doing it like this most of the time. And just so you understand what I mean by call and response, I'll play it with the rest of the vocals and the bass. And again, if things are playing at the same time, they're playing at different frequencies. They have different characteristics that separate them so that I'm not having to do as much EQing. But I know with vocals, I have such horrible habits that I need to break. So next is the leads, the melodies. This is the portion that I sort of wanted to give away, because a lot of it is just variations of the same patch for the most part. Like you can just make a few different tweaks and it's all the same thing. And what's even better is that it's a stock Ableton plugin. It's their analog synth, which is, I feel like even if you have the most like rudimental license for Ableton, you still get it. So the first thing I have, I'll start with the lead synth because again, it is a variation of that. With the lead, again, I'm playing off of what I've written with the bass here. I wanted to just keep things locked in with the rest of my instrumentation and not try to overthink it too much. So the sound itself is just a saw wave. For most of this album, I used saw or square waves. Unless I'm making a bass tone, then I typically go to a sine. Unless I want it to punch more, then I'll use a triangle wave. But this one's a saw wave. I have a filter on it that's pretty open in comparison to what I normally would do. I also have a noise signal coming through, which is giving it that sort of extra bite at the top. That sound. And the filter is helping make sure it like tames it, because without it, it's also giving the synth movement that's a bit random because it's linked to this LFO over here. This LFO is like doing this gradual wave and making sure the filter is just opening and closing in a way so I don't have to do it. I don't have to automate it. It's just something that's happening. It's very useful. And then from there, I have this echo plugin, which I use more than delay. I feel like either is fine. I just like the UI of the echo more. I always have it set to ping pong, and then I'll kind of dial it in from there. I usually have this set to notes or 16ths, and then eighth notes. And that's I always try to match it to the rhythm that I'm going for in the song. And then I just have some saturation, some EQ, compression to catch peaks, and push it back in the mix, sidechain, and saturation. Aside from that, I have another, this is like more of a, this ARP is more like a pad. And I used Ableton's wavetable and I kept it at a sine wave because I wanted something more cool sounding, like more chilled, less abrasive. And the amp here is controlling like the tone, so it feels more like a pluck. And that's really all I have going on with that sound. And then I have an EQ, which I'm using to bring the pluck in and out throughout the song. So I automate that. I have my glue compression to push it back in the mix. This 5 delay, it's a preset from the grain delay in Ableton. And I use it a lot because it gives it this like crystallizing effect that I think is awesome. That's without it. So it just gives it this like little extra sparkle that I think is really cool. And then after that, I have another delay that's doing a lot of heavy lifting to give the sound even more of an ethereal vibe. Yeah, and then after that, I have a bit warmer again. From there, I've got this ARP, which is just a sine wave. I use Serum, but I could have used Wavetable. You can use anything. It's just a saw wave with white noise and a filter dictating how it operates. But what's really giving it that character is not even the reverb that I have on here. It's this delay plugin. Like the reverb gives it room, but the delay is what's giving it that um, sort of like airy feel. It's like kind of doing all the heavy lifting of the sound. And then this last ARP is pretty much the same as the lead, but the filter's turned down. So it feels more subdued. It's still opening up, but nowhere near to the same extent as the lead sound. And again, the whole point here is to give right parts that feel like they're feeding off of each other. And that's all that is. It's very straightforward. Finally, I have some drones, and this is probably the easiest thing. So with all my pads and atmospheres and drones, it's something that I like to start with normally because it's a nice way to just get into a zone. And the whole point of them is to give your song a bit of a world to live in. You're kind of like laying down a foundation of what the general tone of the song is, at least in my opinion. And they're very easy to do. In this case, I used a triangle wave. Who knows why? But I have a bit of a longer release on it. And normally I would even have a very slow attack so it sort of eases into the sound. But that's just how it is for this one. I use Rift. Again, Rift is more of like a distortion delay. It like just mangles sounds. So that's all it's doing for this. And then I have an auto pan, which gives it's just, I don't know how to describe it. This setting on here, you can change the settings in a bunch of ways, but this chaotic one does something so unpredictable and fun. I feel like it gives the synth a lot of character alongside the riff, and it's very fun because again, it's like unpredictable, which is really nice to have any chance you get in dance music. And then I have Air, which is a free reverb plugin. I have this EQ that's just serving as a filter to take the synth in and out of the song when I need it. Blue compressor, this is probably the most extreme version of pushing something back in the mix. That's why the threshold is so low. And then some saturation. And then finally, I have a Serum patch. I want to say this is a preset I got from Splice. It's just 2 sine waves doing some twinkly art business. I didn't make this, so I can't really describe much on it. But the whole point was, again, to give the song some space to live in. And then finally, I have a printed tune. You can see I have this whole group of unused stuff. I'll print it and keep processing, and it's basically just this verbed out, resampled sound that I EQ'd to hell, and don't ask me why. Don't ask me why it's sidechained to itself. I don't know how that happened. That was an accident. But then I have it saturated, and that's pretty much it. There's nothing going on in the group, really any of these groups. I'll try to do some group mixing towards the end, but I think that's pretty much it. On the mastering chain, I used to use the Mixgel preset, but now I use the multiband compression. It's literally just the preset multiband compression. And I'll dial that in accordingly, like whatever amount I want that just sounds good. And then just throw on 2 utilities. One is to make things mono during my buildup. I try not to do it too much, but it's for the same reason that you add, like you take away your low end as you're doing buildups, because then when the drop hits, it feels like full and stereo and big. So that's all that's doing. And then the second utility is just some volume control because I didn't want to use a limiter. That's my streaming plugin, so you can ignore that. Something else that I'll do that's not on here right now when I'm mixing is I'll bring this first notch to probably around like 150 ish, and then I'll bring the top one sometimes all the way down to like there, like 1.5 kilohertz. And then I'll throw this utility in mono and I'll listen to the song like that. And it doesn't make a lot of sense initially, but the whole point of that is when I listen to the song with all of that on, what's crowding the mid range will become immediately recognizable. And then I'll go back into each track and EQ or process things according to that. And then when I take it off, it'll usually sound a lot better. Sometimes it can be very easy to overdo, but I feel like getting that getting that right is a huge indicator of a good mix for me. But yeah, that's pretty much it. I have another song coming out next week from the album called If You Need Me, and I'll do a track breakdown for that too. But I just wanted to show off what I did to make this first one. I want people to understand that it's very easy to do with not a lot of gear, as long as you kind of know what you're going for. And sometimes that takes shape like as you work. But it's a really fun song, and I didn't really want to go much further than that. I just want to make something that felt good and fun and sweet. If you liked the lead patch or any of the sounds in that sort of area, the links to it are down below, and it's free. And if you have any questions or tips, I'm always down to learn a faster way to do something. So yeah, that's it. I'll see you in the next one.